Welcome back to another chapter in our ethical hacking series. I'm Laura, and from time to time, Ammon will be joining us. This chapter will introduce the basics of risk management and disaster recovery. Since we are a part of IT operations in your enterprise, you could be involved in planning and applying policies related to risk management and/or disaster recovery. We do not aim to cover all details or deep understanding of this topic, but we want to give some brief information about this very important domain.
Now, an event that may have an effect on the daily operations of a given entity is called a risk. The effect could vary from downtime and disrupting the usual operations to losing money and sensitive information. Risk management requires an understanding of how security measures are implemented in your environment and how a threat can affect your daily operations. As a result, we need to understand the business operations and what kind of risk to which they might be exposed.
Managing risk is essential since every new technology and software is introduced with new security issues and new risks. Failure to manage given risks will result at least in disruption of normal operations and can escalate to loss of data, loss of money, legal issues, or bankruptcy in some cases.
That's right.
Risk management goal is to reduce the presented risk to an acceptable level.
Now, these levels will vary from one company to another, right? And depending on how big the environment and how much budget is given for the mitigation of those risks. Our target is to identify, control, and minimize the loss caused by risk, and where possible, we want to prevent any risk. Now, given this, we must pay attention to cost. And when planning for risk management, we should balance between the impact of a risk and the cost of protective measures.
Correct, yes. Now, for each scenario, the strategy for managing risks may vary, so we'll briefly note a few of them. When planning to implement a new hardware or new software, we need to test the product in a lab or testing environment and perform vulnerability assessment against the product. By finding the vulnerability prior to implementation, you can plan carefully for how to mitigate those threats, or if it's not possible to mitigate them all, you may accept the remainder of risk.
Now, at the same time, if you already have a risk policy in place, then you must check if the change caused by the new product will affect other products that are in place. Also, check if your security policy allows this change. When introducing a change for a risk management environment or a managed environment, all policies will be affected or changed. Now, your IS department should carefully apply the changes to any related policy and notify all the personnel that have relation in planning or conducting these policies. Finally, the attacks that could not be prevented with risk management should be assessed and response steps must be written. This then goes to the incident response team.
Every day brings up new threats. So when planning for managing threats, natural threats should be considered as well. Man-made disasters like protesting, assault, war, etc., and smaller events like cyber attacks and social engineering should be counted as threats when planning for risk management.
Internal users can be identified as employees or visitors who could introduce a threat by exploiting a vulnerable or weak point, like using a USB on a corporate computer or replying to a phishing email. We should separate between intentional malicious acts and unintentional ones, but not with threats. Despite the intention of the user, the threat remains a risk that should be managed.
Risk analysis is tied with vulnerability assessment. Thus, each identified threat should be analyzed and security measures should be taken to manage the risk posed. Risk analysis is based on qualitative and quantitative analysis. In some cases, we see semi-quantitative analysis too. Now, qualitative analysis uses words or ranks to measure the impact of identified risk rather than do it with numbers. Low, medium, and high are usually used to rank the risks.
That's right. And quantitative analysis is purely numeric numbers and values and is usually based on statistics, historical records, best practices, testing, and experiments. Now, this method could identify which risk has higher loss impact and which risk requires higher budget to mitigate. After identifying the risks and ranking them, the response planning phase starts. In an ideal scenario, the response policy is tested and risk assessment is performed again to make sure the response plan fully covered the risk. This operation is more like a cycle. Every day new threats appear and security controls might not be capable of preventing the new threats. In other words, risk assessment should be performed again whenever a new threat arises.
Correct. And strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats. This is what we call SWOT analysis. Those 4 points are the main studies in order to manage a given risk. Review documentation and research online for potential threats. Risk domains can be DMZ, private network, guest network, cloud network, mobile users, etc. Risk exposure is the impact caused by the risk on the enterprise. Consider also attack skill, the probable occurrence of an attack, the damage from this attack, and the value or controls that could be exploited.
Right, and then, Laura, what we need to do is rank the risk from high to low or high numbers to low numbers and use qualitative and or quantitative methods to further rank the risk, right? Keeping in mind the likelihood of a risk occurrence. Identify countermeasures, which could be security controls that are already in place or new measures that should be taken. And then finally, really document everything.
Likelihood is the possibility that a threat or vulnerability can turn to a real risk and can be exploited. The impact of the risk is measured by quantity of damage caused by the exploit. Likelihood and impact are measured with numbers from 0 to 9, where 0 to 3 is low, and 3 to 6 is medium, and 6 to 9 is high.
Now, to find out the likelihood of a risk, ask these questions, right? What are the skills required for an attacker to exploit the vulnerability? What are the benefits and or motivation for the attacker? What are the requirements to access given resources? Is the vulnerability easy to discover? Is it known by all security professionals and hackers? Is there an exploit already for this vulnerability? Can you detect the attack if it took place?
Yeah, those are really good. Now, to determine the impact of a given risk, now ask, how sensitive is the data that may be disclosed? Is there loss of data integrity or availability? Can you trace the attack source? Will the attack cause financial or reputation loss? Who is the loss visible to? Is there sensitive data at risk or being exposed?
Now, after determining these risks and then ranking them, a response plan for each risk should be applied. Response strategies vary from one risk to another, depending on how severe the risks are. There are 4 strategies known in the industry. Avoidance means that the risk is reduced to 0 or eliminated completely. It's almost impossible to achieve this level by taking security measures. The only way to do this is to remove the cause of the risk, i.e. allowing access to social media is a threat. The only way to avoid it is by blocking access to social media for all the organization, right? Transference is when you transfer the risk to another entity, such as insurance or service provider, where they are accountable 100% for the impact in case an attack occurs.
Yeah. And mitigation is using security controls to protect against a risk until the risk impact is reduced to a level that is tolerated by the organization. Usually there is a numeric value for tolerance specified by each organization. Risk mitigation aims to reduce the impact to meet this level or even lower. Acceptance is the level of tolerance specified by an organization. When all security measures are taken to mitigate a risk, the remainder of impact will be accepted and tolerated as there's no way to remove it 100%.
No. Now, in this demonstration, and really instead of creating a new project for risk assessment, we'll read a project. Now, we have a project which is ready. Now, in this demonstration, we're using PTA, or Practical Threat Analysis, which is a very simple tool and very nice to use for risk assessment. Now, it's good to use because of its simplicity at first. Now, looks like we have this project, which is actually a sample that comes with this tool. Now, if you don't have any previous experience with risk assessment, you can use this sample to learn about how risk assessment is done and then what to include in your own risk assessment. So let's go ahead and get started right here in this main page of the project. Now, what we have here is a company, which is a financial institution, and it deals with currencies and stock markets and really that kind of stuff. Now, the total value of our company, or the total value of assets, which is technically more accurate really in this assessment, is $1 million and almost another half, so $1.5 million. So the total cost of countermeasures implemented after the risk assessment is $164,000, and the mitigation already invested is $16,500. Now, the difference here between those two numbers is the total cost of countermeasures. All the countermeasures, from firewalls or web application firewalls to any security applications that were already implemented and we're still currently using and invested in mitigation right now, after studying the new threats is about $16,000. Now, here's the system risk status. This is a maximum risk level, which is 40%. The current risk level is 23 and the minimum is 8.8. Now, these numbers indicate that any threat that might put us at a risk of 40% is too high. Our threats put us at a risk of close to 23.2%, which is the current risk. Okay? The minimal risk, which we wish to go down to, is 8% of the total asset value. This is really the ideal place to be. This is a very risky place to be, and then this is where we are right now. Okay, moving on, you see that the tool represents for you and visualizes for us the threats and risks and our analysis. Now we have here a chart for the threats. If we look at it, T refers to threats, and we can see here the legend for T9 is malicious, the column is forge, and the state's current currency rate. And this is the impact of this threat. So this threat, if this was successful, the impact of it might reach $150,000. This loss, this is our cost if the attack was successful. And we have threat 10, which might cost us between $50,000 and $100,000. Now I can say that this is kind of 70 or 60 or 70,000. And we have the threat 5, which is a denial of service attack that might cost us around $50,000 and so on. So these are the top 5 risks which are threatening our system based on this analysis. Now here's a chart for the history. It's a percentage, right? And here's the analysis history for what are the threats, the countermeasures, and vulnerabilities. Now, if you want to include or wish to see more details, you can. Now, we're going to go to see our assets. So in any risk assessment project, you have your assets, you have your threats, and you have your vulnerabilities. Now, these are the main project entries, and based on these entries, you can really define what are the countermeasures, implementations, and so on. Let's go ahead and take a look on the assets. And A, in this project, A refers to an asset. So we have the confidentiality of an economist person's information. Now, this is really an intangible risk. And threats associated with this asset are threats 1, 4, and 6. Now, if I want to know what these threats are, I'm going to have to go right here to the threats. And we're going to go there in a few minutes. Now, we also have fixed values, 0, because it's not an asset that you can measure with money. It's the confidentiality of personal information. So it really doesn't have a specific value. In case this asset has been compromised, the cost is going to be very high. Now, reoccurrence value is 15,000, and the annual value is also 15,000. Right? Now, let's say we have another asset here, the availability of daily exchange rate service. So the daily exchange rate service rates, or the daily exchange service rates, count on our assets, on our servers and the state's server, because the company rates are synced with the state rates. So the threats available to those assets are 5 and 7, and the recurrence and annual value is $100,000. Now don't forget, this is just really a sample project. So, right, we have 6 assets. In a real scenario, you can typically have a lot more than 6, right? So here's another one, trust of the public in the exchange rate service. So the trust of the people or our client and our company exchange rate service. So this is the link to the reputation, our company's reputation. If the rates were not accurate, the reputation of your company is going to go down, so people will not trust you anymore. This usually affects everything else. Now, the threats associated with this asset are 5, 7, 9, and 10, and the fixed value is $250,000. Why do you think that is? Why is it so high? Because these rates are on our servers, the people or our public or client connects to our servers to see the rates. So the rates are synced with the state rate or the universal rate. But these rates are available through our servers. This is the cost of our servers, and the annual value is the same. Now, here in the percentage of the value from the total value of our company, if our company has a value of $1.5 million, this is close to 17%. Now, a few minutes ago, we just saw that the cost is about $1.4 million. So we have 6 assets stability of the state's economy. Now, this is intangible and linked to also another type of reputation. 2 threats are associated with it, and the value actually is around $1 million, and the annual is often going to be the same. This is the highest asset we have. Now, this is not controlled by us, but it affects our company heavily. All right, now let's see what are these threats, 5, 7, and 2. So we're going to go right here to the threats menu or page, and we start to read. We have threat 1 to 10. We have 10 threats, so a hacker corrupts the database by SQL injection. We have another threat, an insider corrupt the database with SQL injection. Looks like we also have another insider that connects the database via the LAN and corrupting and modifying the data. Looks like we also have a denial of service attack against our website. Database corruption with a hacker or by a hacker from the internet, if not by SQL, because we've identified SQL previously in a different way. Now here we have another threat, an HTTP request to get access to OS resources. So it means directory traversal. One of these attacks. Now we have here a malicious economist forging the state's currency rates. This is not an attack directed at us on our systems or our assets, but it affects us because if the state rates have been forged with wrong values, then we'll be affected, and hostile countries might manipulate currency rates by recruiting economists. Really, this is also not a direct attack to our assets or to our facilities, but it affects us highly. All right, so let's go ahead and read what we have here on this threat page. If we look down here, we have tags for each of the threats. So we have probability of occurrence. SQL injection from a hacker has 0.33% probability of happening, and the insider 0.16 for another malicious insider. DOS attacks 0.82. That is higher because DOS attack is easier to happen. SQL might be a little bit hard, but DOS attacks and DDoS attacks are actually easier to make happen and be successful. For threats, 0.6, also 0.82, and so on, is the probability of this attack to be successful and to be initiated as successful. This attack threatens which assets, A1 and A3, and which vulnerability can cause this attack. We have vulnerability 6 that we can check from here. And the mitigation plan or countermeasures, the C refers here to countermeasures. So we have countermeasures to mitigate this attack and the risk. So the threat, that's the current risk in percentage, so it's about 2.3%. And now it's a decimal number here, and the values that are at risk is 34,000, 34 and something. Now, if the attack, which has a 0.33% probability of happening, was initiated and successful, it would threaten two assets because of this vulnerability, and the value at risk, or the cost or the loss to our company, would be $34,000. Now, we've implemented this mitigation or these countermeasures. Now, the countermeasures can be implemented, or when you're studying countermeasures, it really should not exceed, of course, the value at risk. This is the ROI, return on investment. So if the mitigation will cost you $50,000 and you're protecting an asset which is only $34,000, that doesn't make any sense. You're losing money. You cannot implement such a countermeasure. But if the countermeasures cost $5,000 and you're protecting an asset that's worth $34,000, then that makes a lot of sense. This is a good strategy or a good mitigation. All right, let's go for two vulnerabilities and see what are the vulnerabilities that can cause them or that can allow an attack to be successful. So we have one server database and a database that is accessible through the internet. So threats 5 and 6 and countermeasures 1. So you notice here that everything is related together. Assets, threats, and countermeasures are all related together and with the vulnerabilities. Now, web server also, a database or machine accessed via a LAN internal network. We have also countermeasures here, and the small description is always helpful for you to remember what it is, and for whoever is reading this document to know really, what are we talking about here? What are we protecting? Vulnerability 4 and database passwords might be sniffed, so mitigation here is to use encrypted networking, encrypted databases, and so on. So an insider might learn passwords that are transferred in plain text. SQL vulnerabilities in MS Server 2003 and IIS 6 have shortcomings that enable exploitations of the operating system via HTTP protocols. Now, mitigation would be something like updating to a newer version or stopping some services that are allowing this vulnerability and so on. So looks like we have a total of 13 vulnerabilities. Now, let's talk about what are the countermeasures implemented for such vulnerabilities. Firewall. And install a firewall. Now, that looks like it's already implemented. Yes, it's a hardware firewall. So which vulnerabilities are we mitigating here? Only vulnerability 1. Now, vulnerability 1 allows two types of attacks or threats, which are threat 5 and threat 6. So we're actually now mitigating two threats. Now, the cost of this mitigation of this hardware firewall is $3,500. A recurring cost of $1,000 might be a subscription to keep the firewall database up to date. Firewall has signatures to detect anomalies, and the annual cost would be $4,500. Why? Well, because we can calculate it this way: the fixed cost as $3,500 plus the recurring cost of $1,000. So now you go in and you're gonna define the annual cost on the first year as $4,500. But if you're studying here, we can create another section or another column. And if you're studying here, the annual cost of this firewall, not only for the first year, which includes the price of the firewall, will be a different formula. The annual cost would be the subscription. So let's say that you're subscribing to the vendor to keep your database up to date and maintenance, maybe a salary for an administrator for this firewall. So all of these could be really included together in the annual cost. Now, it actually depends on how much you want to be specific in these columns and this cost. Countermeasure 2, physically protect access to local network wiring to the data center room, to switches and router closets. So this is some kind of prepared room to have all your network devices and hardware and protection devices and servers all in one room. Now, the cost of implementing this room is going to be about $14,000. Annual cost will be $7,000. So let's say you need to add things like keep it cool in there, so you need to add air conditioning to that room. You need maintenance for the fire extinguisher and this kind of stuff. Enforce quality passwords. So this is a kind of policy, right? So now we see that there is no fixed cost. Why? Well, that's because you're not buying anything here. It's just a policy. Now the reoccurrence cost and the annual cost is $1,000, but it could be here the salary of an administrator handling this kind of stuff. Now, of course, there's no one that that we could get to work for $1,000 annually. If we could, great, we'd all be out there hiring them. But keep in mind that we're really just talking. We're just kind of throwing some examples out here. The numbers are really not real, right? Let's go ahead and proceed through these countermeasures. So we have 20 countermeasures. So we're going to move to another page, which is the attacker type. Now, the attacker type could be a web user, anyone on the internet, an insider, an employee, a hacker from the internet, an economist, or a competitor or state enemy. Now we see that profile and motivation are not filled in these columns, in these fields. Now, of course, I would prefer, and your managers would prefer to have these filled, but motivation for the web user might be a mistake. Now, you can fill it here. It might be by mistake causing some issue, or intentionally because he wants some money or he wants to harm your company and so on. That might be the motivation. Motivation for the hacker may be paid by your competitor or some other reason might be his motivation. Tools available or the way they can access your system is definitely from the internet or from the LAN. So these are really going to be the only two ways to get into your system. Now here are the entry points defined. Now what are the available entry points? The rate page on the web application, right? So from the internet or from the public. The Economist desktop application for updating the rates, which is it's apparently an application to update the currency rates available to economists only. Could be a computer machine on the LAN inside your network. Maybe a database server can be accessed if I have a direct connection to it or a console connection. But mainly the database server will be accessed through the internet by SQL injection or internally also by SQL injection. So we have now the attacker type. We know the attacker type and we know the entries. So now your focus is going to be to close these entries. Now we cannot close them, but with the countermeasures we can define regulations to filter the connections coming into our systems. Now it looks like we have tags if you wish and documents for helping. Now you can see how risk assessment is really easy to read, but it's very hard to create. The risk assessment would need a full vulnerability study. We'll need real cooperation from all the teams to find the values of each assessment and each asset, the cost in case an attack was successful, the cost of mitigation, the return of investment for each mitigation or each countermeasure. There's plenty of documents that are going to need to be created before you get to this point. This is not a project that you need to just spend one day on or a week or even a month. It's a pretty long project that's going to need quite a bit of cooperation and help from some other professional people in your organization to achieve it. The DRP, Disaster Recovery Plan, is a policy that defines how an organization will recover from a disaster, whether it is a natural or man-made disaster. The DRP should protect both people and assets of a given organization. It includes a list of responsible people who will perform the steps for recovery, inventory for the hardware and software, and steps to recover from a disaster. Now, with this said, let's check out a few points on DRP.
DRP first should ensure the security of the people at all cost. Then it plans for business continuity. A backup site can be used in case of disaster, and in this case, resources like IT systems and office supplies should be considered. Now, a full recovery plan may be very expensive. And while most of the organizations cannot afford such a plan, other solutions may be considered that are affordable and can provide continuity of operations. When planning for DRP services, it should be ranked in order to decide which service to be considered first. Business Continuity Plan, or BCP, decides which services are sensitive for the regular operations to continue.
Now, Laura, as you know, DRP ranks a given disaster and acts on it based on its rank. There are many scenarios for each rank. So we're going to try and depict those scenarios as closely as possible. Short term is when a line of service is fully affected. This is a high priority and requires immediate action to recover. An alternate site is a possible solution or a shared site. The ultimate solution is a mirrored site, but this solution is often very expensive. Midterm is part of the business that is affected. So let's say phone lines. The business should still be able to receive customers' needs and requests through online services.
And with long term, some services can affect the daily routine of employees, but not the production. For example, a smoke in the area or cafeteria, this is to be considered as low damage or long-term recovery. On another hand, if a disaster took place and the company migrated to an alternate site, the revert to the original site will be processed in the long-term policy as the original site may be severely damaged and it will take time to recover it.
That's right. And a hot site is an identical site of the primary one, equipped with systems and services just like the primary. Data is duplicated to the hot site. A hot site is tested by disconnecting it from the primary site and observing the switchover process. Usually the switch should be very fast. Warm site is a location that performs non-critical functions for the organization but can be converted to a primary location within a few days. Warm sites can include key systems and databases, but not all the systems. And a cold site is a location owned by the organization, but it contains nothing. In case of a disaster, the organization will start to equip the cold site to perform the base operations. And now this process is probably going to take weeks or months.
Yeah. And data backup solution is a must for any organization. When planning for DRP, this is to be considered a priority. There are 4 standards in DRP to backup data. With tape backups, you can use incremental or differential backup. Know that tapes should be secured in an off-site location. Mirror backups consist of another location holding the same data, each writing to the primary disks and then replicating with a high-speed connection to the mirror site.
Now let's talk a little bit about journaling. This is a less expensive solution that preserves the data as journaling captures only transactions. So in case of a disaster, the full backup tape is used and the journaling is used to write the transactions, again, that were not included in the full backup. Electronic vaulting is an alternate location to preserved backup data. When the backup is complete, it's copied over to a different location. When a disaster occurs, the electronic vault is used and the backup is ready to be restored.
And now the recovery process is tied to the recovery team where they implement procedures and steps to recover from a disaster. The recovery procedure should be well organized with specific steps to restore normal operations. And the recovery team should always make sure to meet the recovery time objective or RTO without exceeding the maximum tolerable downtime or MTD.
That's right. DRP needs maintenance and evaluation on a timely basis. Now, at least once a year, the DRP plan should be reevaluated to make sure of its effectiveness. Changes will be made as necessary. In some organizations, you're probably going to perform a drill every year.
Yes, and when performed, drills should focus on both equipment and personnel, as the operations cannot continue with one of them missing. An off-site drill is performed to check the effectiveness of a DRP and find the gaps, and there's no way to identify the gaps without simulating a disaster.
No.
This method involves transporting systems, data, and personnel to off-site locations such as a warm site and operating the systems as if a disaster has occurred.
That's right, Laura. And now the ultimate way to simulate DRP is when you use a hot site or mirrored site and you cut over the connection between the two sites and operate from the hot site. Gaps identified by each way should be updated to the DRP.
And in case of a disaster, stakeholders of a given organization should be notified as the first step of recovery. Stakeholders are not only the owners, but also the management team clients, employees, investors, suppliers, and board management. Usually there will be an incident manager to perform the recovery process with his team. And the DRP should define step by step the actions taken in a specific disaster.
That's right. Damage assessment can determine the next step for incident response teams, whether a recovery to another location should be performed or actions can be taken on the same primary location. DRP is a long planning and simulating scenario, and is the last policy to be written after risk management, security policy, incident policy, and business continuity planning.
We hope that you learned something new about disaster recovery and risk management. During this course, we cover risk and the strategies that should be employed to manage them.
That's right, Lauren. We also discussed how to analyze security risks by looking at likelihood and impact. Then, what did we discuss next? We talked about response strategy.
Yes, then we finished up the course by discussing how to prepare for a disaster, including creating a DPR and the steps on how to recover your data. Now remember, as an IT specialist, you will be involved in the planning and setup of all of these plans and strategies.
It's really a lot of information that we covered,
Yes,
but it's a lot of good information. Thanks for joining us, and good luck in your risk assessments and disaster recovery.
Yes.